Hello, and welcome to our meeting hosted by the Jewish Deaf Congress as we conduct interviews with the Jewish Deaf authors. I am Brianne Burger, here with Phil Bravin. First, we'll introduce him, then turn it over to Bravin for questions. Phil Bravin was first born in New York. He attended the Lexington School for the Deaf and later became the director of the board there. He has held various positions within the deaf community and in the corporate businesses community over the years. He was formerly the president and chief executive officer of the National Captioning Institute, NCI, which at the time was the largest provider of closed captioning services in the world. Before joining NCI, he worked for IBM for almost 25 years, right? Bravin previously held positions in technical, marketing, and management. He was one of just 4 Deaf Board of Trustees members in 1988. Bravin was chair of the Presidential Search Committee responsible for the selection and screening of finalists for the president of Gallaudet University. In 1966, graduate of Gallaudet and an IBM executive, Bravin became the intermediary between student leaders and the board during the Deaf President Now protest. When Spillman announced her resignation on March 13, 1988, Bravin became the first deaf chairperson of the Gallaudet University Board of Trustees. Today, Phil and his wife, July, live in Chester, Vermont, where they spend as much cherished time as they can with their children and grandchildren. They love traveling, snowshoeing, and hiking. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Do you want to start by telling us about your book?
Sure. This book is something that fills a necessary gap in deaf history about the Deaf President Now movement. We already have a book written from the perspective of DPN activists. We also have a book written from the perspective of a social worker observing the Gallaudet community. This is all one-sided. But what about the perspective by the Board of Trustees? That has never been written before and people had no clue. I decided to write a book that would fill that gap. People will now have the full 360 point of view on what DPN was about. I hope I will succeed in that.
I'm proud to have my own copy of your book. This book is called Controlling Our Destiny, a board member's view of Deaf President Now. What was your inspiration to write this book? Do you believe your Jewish faith or perhaps deaf identity had any contribution to your involvement within the deaf community?
Well, to be honest, as I mentioned in this book, I grew up in the deaf community. I grew up in a deaf family with a strong deaf identity. I was involved in the deaf community and attended deaf clubs. My parents and I would go to the beach with other deaf people. I was always immersed in the deaf community and, therefore, had many deaf role models through life. They would often mention fighting for their rights, against oppression, opening doors for themselves. As I explained in my book, I lived in an apartment in Mount Vernon, New York, just a little outside of New York City. 2 apartments down lived a Gallaudet graduate, class of 1918, and his name was Sylvan Riley. He was quite humble and brilliant, but never got the job he wanted due to oppression. However, he would always talk and advise me, which had developed in me the same fighting spirit he had for the deaf community's rights. I continue to learn and pick up tools by deaf role models. My teachers at New York School for the Deaf, Fanwood, which I also attended after Lexington School for the Deaf, were also supporting and advising me. At Gallaudet, I had other role models who also supported me. That had really inspired me to see that I may have tools to change the world for the betterment of deaf people. One thing just led to another, you know? And that led me to Gallaudet Board of Fellows. I joined the board when I was 37 years old. After some time, they asked me to chair the search committee, but didn't realize what trap I was walking to. I see it as a trap because the trap was to choose a candidate who is best fit for the Gallaudet University, while the deaf community expected we choose a deaf person, period. I had to reconcile both points of views. There was a lot of juggling, a balancing act inside me. Really, I was torn. I eventually realized and decided that Gallaudet University deserved the best. With the search process underway, I decided to go with my heart and found our best candidate, Irving King Jordan. The fighting that ensued, I had to be neutral towards it. Really, if I had shown my true colors, the process would not have been a credible process. I just had to keep moving. Elizabeth Zinser, hearing, and Harvey Corson, deaf, were both viable candidates. Yet what Gallaudet needed was more important. Looking back on it all with 2020 hindsight, that's always better than foresight was. I needed to explain the internal struggle I had because people do not understand the closeness I had to the deaf community being pit against what the world expected of me. My need to explain this really was my biggest inspiration for this book and how I felt. Now, as a Jewish person, I grew up attending synagogue, a deaf temple group. My parents and I would go to deaf gatherings in New York City, where we would always see people being charitable, people who were giving back to the community. The concept of giving back to the community was one I internalized. I grew up with that notion. In Judaism, we have this concept of charity that I grew up admiring. All these years, I haven't changed one bit.
I agree. It's important in both the Jewish and deaf communities. I'm curious, what do you want people to learn from your book?
I would like people to learn two things. Firstly, when you are involved in an important situation, you must be careful. Or I should say, detached in making decisions. I mentioned counting to 100, which refers to one of my favorite quotes. In any situation, before you react, count to 100 first. Often, after you finish counting, the situation has changed and a decision may be easier to come to. This isn't possible 100% of the time, of course, but this is an important strategy to employ. This is what I would like people to learn. To be pragmatic in most situations. Myself, I operate slowly and carefully, with respect to others. Try to be ethical, respectful of people's privacy. Through DPN, the 87 candidates were college presidents, held important positions in the future. All of them would have become lame ducks. I didn't want to be responsible for that. I emphasize often to value privacy in all situations. King Jordan, says in the foreword that he never got a peep from the search committee. Everything was very secure. Again, respect for people's privacy is crucial. Additionally, you must earn their respect. You need to prove to them that you respect them. I feel good about that. Another part is that we must understand that Gallaudet is a mecca for the deaf community. When I attended deaf school, the word Gallaudet was heard every day. Can you imagine? Every day, everywhere you went, Gallaudet. It was like Harvard to us. We had to protect Gallaudet's good name. But after March 6th, the protests and marches began. And it felt as though all the good work the board had done just came crumbling down. I struggled in silence, but often things happen for a reason. In a week, everything changed completely. We swung from one end to the other in just 1 week. Like Charles Gassanti said, God made the world in 7 days, and Gallaudet changed it in 7 days. No other protest has succeeded in change in just 7 days. Most take years and years for a multitude of reasons. DPN, that was a successful protest. I mentioned at the end of the book how a while after I became chairman, I was walking to a trailer for a TV interview. I was sitting out there in the cold with all the TV crew people standing around waiting to record. We all chatted a bit, and I asked for their thoughts about the week of the protests. They said it was an unusual protest because the protesters won. Just 7 days when so many protests take years. It's interesting. DPN was truly an unusual week.
And it made history. That's something forever part of our history. Can you share your experience getting your book published? Was it easy or challenging? What would you like other Jewish deaf writers to know? What is your advice to them?
Getting published is hard for a first-time writer. I see authors out there, Stephen King, writing 30, 40, 50 books. Danielle Steele. I see all these names. How did they do it? It took me 20 years to write this tiny thing. So it's hard. The writing is hard. And it's hard to find a publisher as well. I went to one publisher, but my book did not fit their audience. I went to Gallaudet University Press, but they told me absolutely not, that I needed more information. They were not satisfied with this first draft I had given him. It wasn't sufficient. Ivy Piddle-Wallace, the now retired former head of Gallaudet Press, she was my editor at the time. She pushed me to give more information, and I told Piddle, well, the more that I say, the more I am breaking others' confidentiality. I was constantly pushing the line. Boundaries, and kept inching more forward. They wanted me to tell them more until at some point I decided I was done. There was nothing more I could say without there being legal issues to the HR, and that was why I put a stop to things. It was necessary to set boundaries. Regardless, I am eternally grateful to GU Press because my book is so much more interesting now than where it was. When I go back and read my earlier work, I see something was missing there. For example, what was the reason for DPN movement? Referring to the Milan conference, the oppression that began there spread. writing a fiction and nonfiction book are two very different things as well. Fiction is easy. Stephen King can write many books. Whatever he imagines, he can write. With nonfiction, you must deal with the facts and evidence. I have some notes I keep to cross-reference my writing and ensure everything is correct. My files are not that organized. I had to search through them and find anything. Later, I realized my book needed footnotes, so I had to go back and dig for citations. Writing nonfiction is much harder, and there is more burden of proof on the writer. The last 3 years were the hardest for me. I disciplined myself to get up at 5 in the morning to turn off my email. No lazying about in my PJs, just writing 1 or 2 pages and then kept it going. It gets easier as you get into it. Last month, I was totally burnt out. I was done, but I needed to keep it going. I went to a conference in Texas to meet up with my Gallaudet friend Stephen Baldwin. He's an author himself. I told him how I felt like I had hit a wall. Having written a book himself, he offered to help. He said he could push me to finish no matter what. And we did it. He successfully motivated me to finish the book. I had the last back and forth where Gallaudet Press had a copywriter cleaned it up, fixed up the details in that last month, while we decided on a title and cover. We got comments from people to put on the back of the book. All these details had to come together before we were finished. I felt great, like I had finished a paper for a college class. The book was done and I was relieved. Then I was given a reward by my wife. She knew I had always wanted a model train set, but she told me I had to finish my book first. Now that it had been completed, she surprised me with one.
Wow, that's great motivation, something you won't earn until the end. I want to thank you for writing this book. It's a wealth of history. The footnotes are seriously my favorite part. I also love going back and seeing the old letter. I can really capture and picture everything. My jaw dropped seeing those. I was stunned how well you keep notes. I told all my friends, look, you have to see this. You have to read it. It's a deep dive on the whole story. Now to hear you say there are details missing, I have to laugh, I really do. It looks so organized, really.
Guided archives helped me a lot. But I had some things they didn't have. I'll give them a box, and one of the most important parts, though it may not seem important, were the papers from Dr. Merle. The very end of the papers, Gallaudet didn't have. I found the envelope in my box, addressed from Dr. Merrill to me. When I opened it and read it, I had no idea what to do. I asked the archives, and they had no idea either. We considered publishing it, but Gallaudet Press would not do it. They said they would need to have the family consent. I contacted the family, the 3 brothers and sisters discussed it, and finally granted permission to publish it. That was done. That later proved that Merrill had claimed Gallaudet should have a deaf president. It was shocking. Looking back, he was hearing, and he did not feel comfortable confiding some of his opinions to the board. The board were not ready to hear that. He sent me the letter. I decided to print the letter in my book, otherwise it would have been lost.
I'm glad you did that. Is it in the Gallaudet archives now?
I still have it. I gave an electronic copy to Gallaudet Press. It's in a safe place right now. I have the original here with me.
It's very valuable. That's amazing. I appreciate you sharing your story, and I really enjoyed your book. Are there any last words you would like to share?
I encourage deaf people to write books. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, deaf history will be incomplete. Generations from now need to remember. We're getting old and we won't be around forever. In order to pass these stories along through the years, we need to record our history. The only way is to write books. I keep many important papers. Being able to store physical papers allows us to pass down our historical artifacts, while emails become perishable and eventually lost. Books may be our saving grace. Email, which is not an ideal solution. Books are important. Some books later inspire films. Some people have talked about making movies about DPN. I hope it happens because we need to spread the word. The Coda film helped bring awareness. And there was a currently movie being worked on about DPN. I hope it ends up happening, but we will see.
Well, thank you again for sharing your story with us. Again, this book is called Controlling Our Destiny, A Board Member's View of Deaf President Now by Phil Bravin. Thank you for joining us today.
Anytime.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.